What if everything you were taught about inflation is wrong? Not slightly wrong, not oversimplified. Wrong on purpose. Right now, if you ask an economist, a news anchor, or even your college professor to define inflation, they will tell you it is simply the rise in prices. That is the definition printed in textbooks, repeated on the news, and quoted by central banks around the world. But here is the uncomfortable truth. That was not always the definition. For most of economic history, inflation meant something completely different. It meant an increase in the money supply. Prices rising was not the definition of inflation. Prices rising was the result of inflation. Somewhere along the way, that distinction disappeared, and I am going to argue in this video that the disappearance was not an accident. It was convenient. It shifted blame. It moved accountability away from the institutions that create money and placed it onto vague, impersonal forces like supply chains, corporate greed, or external shocks. By the end of this video, you will understand why historians and economists quietly changed the meaning of one of the most important words in economics, and why that single change has shaped monetary policy, government spending, and your own purchasing power for over a century. Let's start with the two competing definitions, because everything else in this video builds on this foundation. The classical definition, used by economists for centuries, defined inflation as an increase in the money supply relative to the goods and services available in an economy. Under this view, if a government or central bank creates more currency without a corresponding increase in real production, that expansion itself is inflation. The rise in prices that follows is simply a symptom, a delayed consequence of that monetary expansion working its way through the economy. The modern definition, the one you hear today, defines inflation purely as a sustained rise in the general price level, usually measured through indexes like the Consumer Price Index. Notice what happened in that shift. The cause and the effect got swapped. Under the old definition, if prices rose because a central bank printed more money, we would say inflation caused prices to rise. Under the new definition, we simply say prices rose, full stop, with no mention of where the new money came from or who created it. This is not just semantics. When the definition changes, so does the story of who is responsible. If inflation is prices rising, you can blame landlords, farmers, oil producers, or even greedy corporations. But if inflation is money supply expanding, the responsibility shifts directly to central banks and governments, the very institutions that control the printing press. That is the thesis of this video. The modern definition of inflation was not a neutral scientific correction. It was a redefinition that conveniently removed accountability from the institutions creating money and shifted it onto everyone else. To prove this, let's walk through history. Our first stop is ancient Rome, roughly 2,000 years ago, long before central banks or paper money existed. The Roman Empire's primary currency was the denarius, a silver coin that formed the backbone of trade across the empire. In its early days, the denarius was nearly pure silver, and its value was trusted throughout the Mediterranean world. But as the empire grew, so did its expenses. Wars needed funding, armies needed pay. Public works, grain subsidies, and imperial luxury all required enormous amounts of money. Rather than raising taxes directly, which was politically unpopular and difficult to enforce across a sprawling empire, Roman emperors found a quieter solution. They reduced the amount of silver in each coin while keeping its face value the same. This process is called debasement. Under Emperor Nero, the silver content of the denarius dropped noticeably. By the time of Emperor Gallienus in the 3rd century, the coin was barely 5% silver, the rest filled with cheap base metal. On paper, the empire had more coins in circulation than ever before. In reality, each coin represented far less actual value. This is a textbook example of the classical definition of inflation. The money supply, in this case the number of coins and their nominal value, expanded far faster than the actual wealth backing them. And what followed? Prices for bread, wine, and basic goods skyrocketed across the empire. Merchants began refusing to accept debased coins at face value. Trust in Roman currency collapsed, contributing to economic instability that weakened the empire during a period of crisis. Historians often describe this simply as prices rose in the Roman Empire, but that description misses the mechanism entirely. Prices did not rise on their own. They rose because the money itself was deliberately weakened by those in power. The lesson from Rome is simple, and it will repeat throughout this video. When the supply of money is expanded or debased without real economic growth to back it, price increases are not a mysterious event. They are a predictable consequence. Let's fast forward roughly 1400 years to 16th century Europe, to an event historians call the Price Revolution. This is one of the most well-documented inflationary periods before the modern era, and it offers powerful evidence for the classical definition of inflation. During this period, Spain was extracting massive quantities of gold and silver from its colonies in the New World, particularly from mines in modern-day Mexico and Bolivia. Spanish galleons carried enormous shipments of precious metal across the Atlantic, flooding Spain and eventually all of Europe with new money. Sounds like wealth, right? More gold, more silver, more prosperity. But that is not what happened. As this new silver and gold entered circulation, the money supply across Europe expanded dramatically, while the actual production of goods, food, textiles, tools, did not increase at anywhere near the same pace. The result was a sustained multi-decade rise in prices across the continent. Bread, grain, and basic commodities became significantly more expensive, and this price surge hit ordinary working people especially hard, since wages did not rise nearly as fast as prices. Interestingly, this connection between money supply and prices was not lost on thinkers at the time. A group of scholars, known as the School of Salamanca, based in Spain, were among the first to formally articulate what we now recognize as the quantity theory of money. They observed directly that the massive influx of New World silver was driving up prices across Europe, and they wrote about this connection with remarkable clarity for their era. This is important because it shows that the classical understanding of inflation, money supply driving prices, is not some modern reinterpretation invented to serve an agenda. It is one of the oldest and most consistently observed patterns in economic history, recognized by scholars centuries before modern central banking even existed. The price revolution reinforces the lesson from Rome. Whenever new money enters an economy faster than real goods and services are produced, prices eventually rise to reflect that imbalance. Now let's move to one of the most extreme and well-known examples in modern history: Weimar Germany in the early 1920s. After the devastation of World War I, Germany faced crushing reparations payments imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, alongside massive war debts and a shattered industrial base. Rather than raising taxes to unsustainable levels or defaulting outright, the German government chose a different path. It began printing enormous quantities of paper money to cover its obligations and fund government spending. At first, this seemed to work, but as the money supply expanded at a staggering rate, something predictable happened. Prices began to rise, slowly at first, and then catastrophically. By 1923, Germany experienced one of history's most infamous cases of hyperinflation. Prices doubled every few days. People famously needed wheelbarrows full of banknotes just to buy bread. Workers demanded to be paid daily, sometimes twice a day, because by the time they walked home, their wages had lost significant value. Savings that had taken a lifetime to accumulate became worthless within months. This is where we introduce an important concept that mainstream discussions of inflation almost always ignore: the Cantillon effect. Named after the 18th century economist Richard Cantillon, this concept explains that new money does not enter an economy evenly. It enters at specific points, usually through governments, banks, or large institutions, and spreads outward gradually. Those who receive the new money first, in Weimar Germany's case, the government and those closest to it, can spend it before prices rise to reflect the new supply. But by the time that money reaches ordinary workers, savers, and pensioners, prices have already adjusted upward. In other words, inflation does not hurt everyone equally. It functions as a hidden wealth transfer, moving purchasing power away from those on fixed incomes and modest savings, and toward those positioned closest to the source of new money creation. Weimar Germany makes this transfer painfully visible. Pensioners who had saved responsibly for decades saw their life savings evaporate, while those who borrowed heavily and repaid their debts in rapidly devaluing currency effectively saw their obligations vanish. This is not just a story about prices rising. It's a story about who gains and who loses when a government chooses to expand the money supply rapidly, and it foreshadows a pattern we will see again in modern economies. Now we arrive at what many historians consider the single most important turning point in modern monetary history: August 15th, 1971. For decades, the global monetary system operated under the Bretton Woods framework, established after World War II. Under the system, the US dollar was pegged to gold at a fixed rate, and other major currencies were pegged to the dollar. In theory, this meant the amount of money in circulation was tied, at least loosely, to a tangible, limited resource. Governments could not print unlimited money without eventually running into the constraint of their gold reserves. But by the late 1960s, the United States was spending heavily, funding the Vietnam War, expanding social programs, and running persistent budget deficits. Other countries, seeing the dollar being printed in ever larger quantities, began demanding to redeem their dollar holdings for actual gold, as the system technically allowed. As gold reserves at Fort Knox began draining, President Richard Nixon made a decision that would reshape the global economy. He suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold. This move, intended as temporary, effectively ended the Bretton Woods system permanently. For the first time in modern history, the world's major currencies were no longer tied to any physical commodity. They became what economists call fiat currency, money that has value simply because governments declare it does, and because people trust and accept it. This was a profound structural change. Without the constraint of gold backing, governments and central banks gained the ability to expand the money supply far more freely than at any point in previous centuries. And the results followed a now familiar pattern. Throughout the 1970s, the United States and much of the developed world experienced a prolonged period of high inflation combined with stagnant economic growth, a combination so unusual it earned its own name, stagflation. Oil price shocks certainly played a role, but underlying those shocks was a monetary environment that had fundamentally changed. The money supply was no longer anchored to anything physical, and prices reflected that shift. Nixon's decision in 1971 is arguably the single most consequential moment in the story of modern inflation, because it removed the last meaningful external constraint on money creation, and it happened with remarkably little public debate about its long-term consequences. This brings us to the core argument of this video, and why the definition of inflation matters so much more than most people realize. Inflation is not, at its heart, a purely technical or mathematical phenomenon. It is fundamentally a political choice. When a government or central bank decides to expand the money supply, whether through printing currency, purchasing government debt, or lowering interest rates to encourage borrowing, that decision is not dictated by some unavoidable law of nature. It is a policy decision made by people with real consequences for other people. Framing inflation purely as prices rising obscures this entirely. It makes inflation sound like weather, an external force that simply happens to an economy, rather than the direct, traceable result of specific decisions made by specific institutions. There is another layer to this that deserves attention: the difference between consumer price inflation and asset price inflation. When most people hear the word inflation, they think of the Consumer Price Index, which tracks the cost of everyday goods like food, fuel, rent, and clothing. But newly created money does not only flow into consumer goods. Often, a significant portion flows into financial assets first: stocks, bonds, real estate, and other investments. This is why, during periods of significant money creation, we frequently see stock markets and property prices surge dramatically, even when official consumer price inflation appears moderate. Someone holding stocks or real estate benefits enormously from this kind of inflation, while someone relying purely on wages and savings sees little benefit and often faces higher costs of living as asset price increases eventually filter into rents and other expenses. This is the Cantillon effect playing out in modern form. Central banks, through mechanisms like open market operations and interest rate policy, are the primary engines of money creation in modern economies. When they expand the money supply, whether explicitly through printing or through the banking system's ability to create credit, they are making a choice with distributional consequences. Someone benefits first, someone else absorbs the cost later. Understanding inflation as a political and monetary choice, rather than a mysterious price phenomenon, is essential to understanding who actually benefits from these policies and who bears the burden. Let's bring the story into more recent history. After the turbulence of the 1970s, the period from the early 1980s through 2007 became known as the Great Moderation, a stretch of relatively stable inflation and steady economic growth across much of the developed world. Central banks, having learned painful lessons from stagflation, became more disciplined about managing money supply growth and interest rates. But stability did not mean the underlying system had changed. Money was still fiat, still created without any physical backing, and still subject to policy decisions rather than natural constraints. Then came 2008. The global financial crisis exposed deep vulnerabilities in the banking and financial system, and central banks responded with an unprecedented tool: quantitative easing. This involved central banks creating vast amounts of new money to purchase government bonds and other financial assets, injecting liquidity directly into financial markets. The stated goal was to stabilize the economy and prevent a deeper collapse. And to be fair, it likely did help avoid a more severe crisis. But consistent with the Cantillon effect, much of this newly created money flowed first into financial markets, contributing to a remarkable surge in stock prices and asset values throughout the 2010s, even as wage growth for ordinary workers remained comparatively sluggish. Then came 2020 and the COVID-19 pandemic. Governments and central banks around the world responded with monetary and fiscal expansion on a scale rarely seen outside of wartime. Massive stimulus packages, direct payments to citizens, and aggressive central bank asset purchases dramatically expanded the money supply in a very short period. For a while, the effects on consumer prices seemed muted, partly due to pandemic-related disruptions in spending patterns. But by 2021 and into 2022, the delayed consequences became impossible to ignore. Inflation surged to levels not seen in decades across much of the developed world. Grocery prices, fuel costs, housing costs, and general living expenses rose sharply, squeezing household budgets everywhere. Officials initially described this inflation as transitory, suggesting it would fade quickly. It did not fade quickly. And when we look at this period through the classical lens of inflation, the pattern is entirely consistent with everything we've seen throughout history: an enormous, rapid expansion of the money supply, followed with a lag by a corresponding rise in prices. The mechanism connecting Rome, 16th century Europe, Weimar Germany, and 2021 is fundamentally the same. Only the technology and terminology have changed. Let's summarize the specific ways this history tends to get misrepresented or oversimplified. First, history. Inflation strictly to rising prices, without connecting that rise to its underlying monetary cause. This creates a narrative where inflation appears to happen randomly or is blamed entirely on external factors like supply chains, geopolitical events, or corporate behavior, while the role of money supply expansion is minimized or ignored altogether. Second, there's a consistent tendency to overlook the money supply itself as the starting point of the story. Whether it was Roman coin debasement, Spanish silver imports, German banknote printing, or modern quantitative easing, the expansion of money is treated as background detail rather than the central cause. Third, asset price inflation is routinely overlooked in mainstream discussions. Official inflation statistics typically focus on consumer goods, while the dramatic rise in stock markets, real estate, and other financial assets during periods of monetary expansion receives far less attention, despite representing a significant and consequential form of inflation in its own right. And fourth, the Cantillon effect, the uneven distribution of newly created money's benefits and costs, is almost entirely absent from popular historical narratives. This omission matters enormously because it hides the fact that inflation is not a neutral, evenly distributed phenomenon. It systematically benefits those closest to the source of new money, while burdening those further away, typically wage earners, savers, and retirees on fixed incomes. Taken together, these four blind spots create a historical narrative that treats inflation as a mysterious, impersonal force rather than what it actually is: a traceable, historically consistent pattern rooted in decisions about money supply. So where does this leave us? Across 2,000 years of history, from debased Roman coins to Spanish silver, from Weimar banknotes to modern quantitative easing, one pattern holds remarkably consistent. When the supply of money expands faster than the real production of goods and services, prices eventually rise to reflect that imbalance. This is not a coincidence repeated across unrelated civilizations. It is a fundamental economic mechanism, observed and documented since at least the 16th century, and arguably understood intuitively even in ancient Rome. Inflation, understood correctly, is not simply something that happens to an economy. It is, in large part, a policy choice made by governments and central banks who control the creation of money. And because it functions as a kind of hidden tax, quietly transferring wealth from savers and wage earners to those who receive newly created money first, it is a policy choice with significant political convenience. Unlike direct taxation, which requires public debate, legislation, and visible accountability, inflation erodes purchasing power gradually and often invisibly, making it a historically popular tool for governments seeking to fund spending without the political cost of raising taxes directly. Understanding this history does not mean every price increase can be attributed solely to money supply changes. Supply shocks, geopolitical events, and other factors genuinely do play a role in specific situations. But the broader historical pattern is unmistakable, and it deserves far more attention than it typically receives in mainstream discussions of inflation. The next time you hear inflation described simply as prices going up, remember the fuller story: the debased denarius, the flood of Spanish silver, the wheelbarrows of German banknotes, and the decision made in 1971 that untethered money from any physical constraint. History does not simply repeat by coincidence. It repeats because the underlying incentives for governments to create money quietly rather than tax openly remain remarkably consistent across centuries. If this video changed how you think about inflation, that's exactly what history should do. If you found this breakdown valuable, hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who deserve to understand this history. If you're new here, consider subscribing and turning on the notification bell, because we're going to keep digging into overlooked stories behind the economic systems shaping our daily lives. In our next video, we'll explore how central banks actually create money out of nothing through the modern banking system, and why that matters more than most people realize. Once you understand that mechanism, you'll never look at a bank statement the same way. Thanks so much for watching, and see you next time.